Okay, good evening. We're going to go ahead and bring tonight's Budget Committee meeting to order. Welcome, everybody. So tonight, the City Manager will be presenting his recommended FY15 budget. After that, we'll have a chance for questions and comments from the group. Thursday will be the opportunity for the public to provide comment on the recommended FY15 budget that the City Manager presents tonight. And that's the time when we would be moving forward with motions to either adopt based on what he recommends or put forward any other motions that we would want to do to amend. I would like to hear about any thoughts that you have about any of those motions in our discussion tonight, but in terms of formally making motions, we won't do that until Thursday after we've had a chance to hear from the public. And so, with that, I will turn it over to John to go ahead and present his recommended budget.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here once again. This has been a robust process, and I don't think you'll see anything new that I present. You've seen it before. In fact, you approved it, or the strategies that I'll present tonight are the same strategies that you saw a couple of months ago. And so I think it's a good budget, and it's a responsible budget. But just as a reminder of where we've been through this process, back in last year's budget, we went through quite a bit of conversation about filling gaps, and eventually the Budget Committee and eventually the Council said, you know, as we move into the FY15 budget, we want more time. We'd like to take additional time to talk about strategies as we move forward to close a gap into the future. And at the time, there was a $5.3 million gap that we had talked about that we had used some of our one-time money to fill with the anticipation of this year of creating different kinds of strategies, which we've done. And so we really started back in July with a number of Budget Committee meetings. We had community workshops around the community to get some input. He would put together a finance investigative team. The purpose of that team was really to verify information and data and ensure that the information was complete. Went through a public hearings process in January. In February, I presented budget strategies for your consideration. This body went through deliberations on that, came down to a set of strategies which then you said yes to as a majority of the body. The revenue team throughout this time was also putting together information about various revenue scenarios that could be moved forward at some point should this body and then eventually the council to choose. And all of that has brought us to this day in which I make the formal presentation for our FY15 budget. So we've had a very robust process throughout this past many months. Throughout this year and for the last 5 years, our budget principles have not changed. What we've said is we need to balance our fiscal responsibility, and when we talk about fiscal responsibility, those are things like living within our means. We're talking about how do we ensure that we have a reasonable and responsible reserve. How do we continue to invest into the community with those dollars? But we want to balance that against community services and employee satisfaction. And so we've continued to propose, and eventually the council has continued to say, yes, all the services that we provide in this community are important to various people, particularly as we have worked our way through the deepest recession since the 1930s. People have relied upon the services we provide, and so we said we want to continue to provide those in a balanced approach. And we want to minimize the impact out into the community, and so together we've done that. We've also said that employee satisfaction has to be balanced against that. And we did not want to lay off employees for a variety of reasons. One, our employees do excellent work. We respect and value their work and have for decades. And on a practical sense, we didn't want to contribute to the difficulties within the community that were working their way through with the recession by adding more unemployed people into the ranks. And so throughout, there have only been while we've decreased by over 100 positions, there have only been 2 employees that have involuntarily left the organization. So we're proud of that. It doesn't mean that people in the organization haven't had to adjust. Some have had to have new jobs and recreate some of the things that they're doing. But we've made a very conscious and a very strong management attempt to minimize that kind of impact. And we've also said throughout the recession, it's not just about surviving. We really want to thrive into the future and continue to invest in the community. We've talked quite a bit about a stable versus a sustainable budget. And really for the last 5 years and the FY15 budget really represent stable budgets. And that's where we say our revenues exceed our expenditures on an operational basis over time. We live within our means. But we also need to maintain a responsible and reasonable reserve. Some of that has been able to help us weather through some fiscal potholes. We continue to use those reserves every year. We'll continue to use those in FY15. But by maintaining reserves, it gives us time in which to make some adjustments as the recession has continued to play itself out. And then the mantra that I have and we have said from the beginning is really to correct the structural deficiencies in a budget and in the budget through a recession. We need to use ongoing revenues for ongoing expenditures. And we've done that. Together we have pretty well done that, and I'll show some slides that demonstrate the results of that. But we also know that a stable budget isn't where ultimately we want to be or is the best outcome for us. It's really a sustainable budget. And we all know that there are a number of places that really do need some additional attention. Ongoing facilities maintenance. We've had conversations about parks and recreation facilities and maintenance that we want to develop those, and we want to maintain them. We do have infrastructure that needs some work. Our pools need some work, as well as some other facilities. The human services funding, while we have endeavored to keep that consistent and constant through the years, it is not necessarily adequate for the needs that we find ourselves in this community. And so we need to continue to think about that. There was a council subcommittee a couple years ago that spent some time thinking about human services funding and what can we do for the long term. The ambulance transport fund, that has been out there for the last 5 or 6 years. Chief Groves has done an amazing job of working with the ambulance transport fund and continuing to make that a stable fund, but it also is a place where we need to continue to focus some efforts. We have regional radio systems that are changing and are important for our public safety and our public works that we need to be anticipating. Jail beds, while the county has lifted a piece of that tide, more needs to be thought about that. The continued implementation of Envision Eugene, pavement preservation, we're down the road on that, but there's still work to do. And so sustainable budget is where we need to continue to think about and focus some effort. This is a variation of my favorite graphs this year. And because I think it tells such a great story that together we've done some pretty interesting things financially. So what this says on the left side of the graph, from prior to the recession, and that's at FY03 to FY09, leading into that, our expenditures, and this is the general fund operating budget. So that's generally the budget we think about when we're talking about all of this. On an average basis, those expenditures were increasing at 6.2% per year, while our revenues were increasing at 4.2% per year. So what that shows is even leading into the recession, we had an imbalance in our revenues and expenditures. And that was, for a number of years, was masked in the sense that the economy generally could account for that. And that was fine. And we kind of were working through that. The recession hits. That primarily means that the economy dampens. Our revenues decrease significantly. And so as you can see, through that, the prime years, the core years of the recession, our revenues increased at less than 1% per year. Now, the only way that you can survive through that and then thrive on the far side of that is we continue to match our expenditures to our revenues. And what we continually said was we need to only use one-time or ongoing monies for ongoing expenses, ongoing revenues for ongoing expenses. And because we did that and we continue to work that, our actual expenditures matched our revenues. And so coming out of the recession, what we see is our revenues are anticipated to increase at 3.1% per year, while our expenditures are less than that. And so that's a fundamental shift in our structure of our budget as we've worked through the recession over the last 5 or 6 years. Now what this also says is we don't anticipate the same revenue growth as we had leading into the recession. We've talked about that. We don't think we're going to get back to the same kind of economy and its fiscal impact onto the city for years to come. And the $30 million, nearly $30 million that we have reduced in ongoing expenses, which has allowed this to happen, that $30 million is not going to be coming back anytime soon to backfill that. So what we've done is we fundamentally said we need to shift the way we going out of the recession rather than going in. And so it sets us up for a stable budget going forward. If we hadn't adhered to that one-time versus ongoing, what happens coming out of the recession is our revenues are at 3.1%, but we're back at the 6.2% or more. And we don't have any reserves. So the hard work is paying off for us fiscally as we move forward. Through all of this, what we've said is we need to reduce the organizational footprint to make this happen. And remember, throughout this, the intent has been to balance services, employees, and our fiscal stability. So we have reduced significantly the organizational footprint. The proposed budget for FY15 puts us under 9 FTE per capita out into the community. I think it's per 10,000, per 1,000 in the community. That's the lowest employee per capita that we know of in our budgeting history. But by the same time, what we've said is we've only had 2 people involuntarily leave the organization. Again, it's not, there's been impacts on employees internally, but we've tried to minimize some of those as much as we can, and there's been a lot of work in that from a variety of pieces of that. And we said we want to continue to invest in the community, and we see that. There's close to $200 million of public and private investment in the downtown. I haven't been here but 6 years. People that have been around here for a long time say there's more activity in the downtown than has gone on in decades. That's positive. There's more street maintenance occurring than in the history of this community, thanks to the voters twice. So we're earning their trust. That's positive. We moved the police into, for them, a new facility out on Country Club Road, and that had been hanging out there for a long time. Our municipal court, which was in the old city hall, is in a facility that actually works for them and works for the people that they see. Those are all positive. The city hall is on tap to move forward. The eWeb site is getting ready to be redeveloped in some pretty interesting and exciting ways. We have new police officers, 9 new police officers downtown. All of those kinds of things, we're continuing to invest in the community as we move forward. Envision Eugene is a long process, and we know that, but I think it's paying off in a variety of quarters, part of which is part of it's enabled us to have new and different kinds of conversations that we hadn't and probably couldn't have had without going through that. There's actually conversations in River Road and Santa Clara now that you can actually say annexation and you can get out of there okay. And part of those conversations, I think we can have those because some of that started through the Envision Eugene portion of that conversation. So I think all of that's a positive as we move forward. But we need to continue to think about how do we increase the tax base for our economic prosperity in the context of Envision Eugene that feels right for us. And then we are continually looking for efficiencies and improvements on a variety of things. The fire merger is just one example of something that I think years ago we would have said, I don't know if that could happen, but they're all wearing the same patch now. And to me, that's a huge milestone. And so it's those kinds of things that what we've said is it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving as we move through the recession. The proposed budget is almost $500 million, so it's a lot of money. The community entrusts us with a lot of money to be good stewards of. And that's what we continue to do together in a variety of ways. The operating budget, that's the $280 million. Now, this is more than just the general fund. This is talking about the entire budget, which includes scores of different funds in a variety of things. But so what you can see on here is the bulk of it is operating. That's the kind of things that we do every day that we pay for, that people see out on the street, and that's kind of what all that work goes for. And then you can kind of see around what else happens. We do invest a little over $25 million per year in capital. As we've said on the sustainable budget, $25 million is good. $25 million isn't enough if we want to sustain some of these other kinds of things in the future. And so that's future conversations we will have. And then you can see some of the others that we can be happy to talk more about in detail if you'd like to. So where do we stand just from some of our major funds? The general fund with the FY15 proposed budget is stable. What that means is we're living within our means as we look over the forecast period. We're maintaining a reasonable reserve. It's not at the place that we would like it to be, but it's reasonable given our current fiscal circumstances. We continue to maintain a balance of services, and we continue to invest into the community. Airport fund, as you know, the airport continues to set records, monthly and annual records. Tim Dahl and his team out there are extremely active and aggressive in airport development, and we see the fruits of that with flights that have moved in over the last couple of years, increasing destinations for people to reach. I mentioned the ambulance transport fund, and we will want to have more conversations about that over the next year or two. The construction and rental housing fund, you might remember a couple years ago, I think it was yellow, could have even been bordering on red, and that's because of the activity in the community. What Sarah and her team have done, and not only is the development starting to tick up, which is good, but they've also continued to figure out ways to leverage technology and other kinds of things to make them continually more efficient with that. And so that's positive as they're moving forward. Parking fund, we've touched on that. We do need to have some more conversation about that. Some of it's policy questions, but some of it's just straight financial discussions and conversation we'll want to have. Transportation fund, as you know, the voters said yes twice. If we continue to maintain the trust, I think they'll keep saying yes. So that's a positive. Stormwater and wastewater, they're stable funds. Part of what happens with those is you need to continue to keep on top of those because there's capital and operating that continues to need to happen, which means, yes, there are going to be periodic rate increases as we go, which is okay. That's a good way to manage these kinds of funds. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Twyla to keep moving us through.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Twyla Miller with the Finance Division. And while there are over 30 reporting funds and 100 subfunds that make up the city's organizational or financial structure, tonight we will be reviewing the general fund and the general fund forecast. The general fund is the largest of all city funds, and it consists of the main subfund, the cultural services subfund, and the equipment replacement subfund as shown on the slide. Tonight's presentation is about the main subfund of the general fund. These resources are the discretionary dollars of the organization that aren't earmarked by statute or council policy for a specific purpose. They are the primary funding source for many of the services provided by the city, including police, fire, parks, libraries, and general government activities. A schedule of the main subfund is on page 84 of your budget document, so you can see this portion of the general fund, as well as the combined fund schedule for the general fund, which is on page 83. So this chart shows the components of the FY15 proposed operating revenues in the main subfund. These revenues are $129.8 million, which is an increase of about 2.4% from FY14 adopted budget revenues. There are well over 100 different revenue sources that flow into the general fund, but they can all be grouped into the several categories you see here and include things like taxes, charges for services, and state shared revenues. Property taxes continue to be the major source of revenue into the general fund at approximately $86 million in FY15, which represents 66% of general fund revenue. While there are many variables that can impact property tax revenues, two major drivers that we monitor are assessed value and the collection rate. So assessed valuation is the value set on taxable property as a basis for levying property taxes. Future year increases in assessed value are generally limited to 3%, with certain exceptions under Measure 50. Under Measure 50, assessed value cannot exceed the real market value of property. This chart shows the drop that occurred in assessed value growth after the recession began. So if you look to the left, pre-recession, assessed value was growing on average at about 4.2% per year. This percentage was higher than the 3% limitation due to additions to the tax rolls. Since the start of the recession, that rate of growth has dropped to 2.5% on average, excluding the impact of the Hynex plant revaluation in FY11. The FY15 bar on the far right shows a projection based on a moderate growth rate of 2.5%. And I'll talk more about growth rate assumptions around property tax revenues in a moment. So overall, while assessed value isn't growing at pre-recession levels, it's still growing in Eugene, which is a good thing because that's not happening everywhere in the country. The other significant driver that impacts property tax revenue is the collection rate. Property tax collection rates are presented in two ways as shown on the chart on the left-hand side. The gross levy method, represented by the blue line, shows the percentage collected of the total levy as shown on the tax bills the assessor sends out each fall. This is the way we talk about the collection rate in the budget and in the forecast. The adjusted levy line, shown by the green line, represents the collection rate of the total levy less adjustments and discounts. This is the method that we show in the city's financial report, or the CAFR. The most significant factor in the adjusted levy is the discount of 3% given to taxpayers who pay their tax bill in full every November on November 15th. The difference between the two methods over this time period has averaged 2.9%. And as you can see under either method, the recession hasn't impacted the collection rate. The chart on the right shows the budgeted versus actual property tax collection over the past 10 years. You can see there are years in which we budgeted more than we actually collected. However, the average variance over this time period is within 0.2%. The anomaly you see there in FY10, that little blip, is due to an adjustment in that year, which includes the Hynex penalty payment for disqualification from the enterprise zone exemption, which we did not budget to receive in that year. So this chart is looking at property tax projections and kind of the range we look at when we look at the forecast. So property tax revenues can be uncertain, as future revenues are dependent on what happens with the economy and the dynamics of the property tax system. When we look to the future to forecast property tax revenues, growth rates, a variety of factors are taken into consideration, including current information we receive from the county assessor, and then trends we look at on property values and housing and building activity. We use this information to model a range of possible outcomes based on optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic growth assumptions. So when we incorporate those growth rates into the forecast, we don't want to use projections that are too optimistic, so we aren't having to cut services in a couple of years if revenues aren't reaching those levels. On the other hand, we don't want to use it too pessimistic of a growth rate because we don't want to overcorrect in the current year for future things that may or may not happen in the out years of the forecast. So this slide shows the range of potential outcomes across the forecast period, with our current projection represented by the blue line in the middle. This reflects a moderate growth rate assumptions, which assumes the economy improves and growth occurs over the forecast period. And you can see, if you look to the left, all of the projections are fairly close in the first 2 years of the forecast period, but that range of uncertainty grows as you, the further you go out into the forecast. So now we'll move on to expenditures. The two primary categories in the general fund operating budget are personnel and materials and services, or M&S. Personnel expenditures comprise approximately 77% of the general fund budget expenditures. Most of the services we provide are people-driven, such as police officers and firefighters for public safety and librarians for library services. And personnel costs include things like salaries, fringe benefits, overtime, and temporary help. M&S expenditures are quite varied, on the other hand. They can include things like payments to the Human Services Commission, utility costs, and then purchases for the services we deliver, such as media and books for the libraries. If you look to the bottom of the slide, you can see the share of M&S expenditures has been going down from previous levels for two reasons. The first is personnel costs are going up at a higher rate than M&S. And also, we have squeezed M&S budgets over the past several years as we've implemented organizational footprint reductions. As we are heavily dependent on personnel, we actively monitor the PERS system. So the pie chart on the left side shows the liabilities of the system by category. Current employees are shown in Tier 1, Tier 2, and OPSERP categories. However, 68% of the liabilities represent people who are no longer employed by a PERS employer. The majority are retired, and 8% are inactive, those who are still working, but they're not in a PERS-covered position. If you look to the right, to the asset side, the vast majority of dollars in the PERS system have come from investment earnings. Since 1970, nearly 3/4 of the funding in the system are from this source. Now we'll talk a little bit about PERS reform. There have been a number of changes over the years to the PERS system, including many in recent decades aimed at lowering system costs. The most notable have been creation of additional tiers of employees with lower cost benefit levels. Last year, the legislature enacted 3 PERS reform bills, which will lower system costs and liabilities. Senate Bill 822 placed further limits on COLAs and eliminated compensation for Oregon taxes on benefits for retirees who live outside of Oregon. Senate Bill 861 superseded the COLA portion of Senate Bill 822. And finally, Senate Bill 862 made additional changes to benefit levels for certain participant classes, which lowered costs. However, both Senate Bill 822 and Senate Bill 861 are currently being litigated, so there is uncertainty over future impact on PERS rates. Our current forecast assumes that these changes to the PERS system survive the litigation and that pension costs are lowered over the long run. The PERS board also enacted several administrative changes this last year, and the most notably reducing the assumed earnings rate from 8% to 7.75%. As you will recall from the slide we just looked at, investment earnings are over 70% of total assets in the system, so this will have an impact on future employer rates as we move forward. So this slide is looking at PERS statistics for the city of Eugene. And it shows the change in employer rates we are anticipating for the next 2 budget years, as well as total PERS costs for the general fund. In FY15, we've budgeted $10 million, which is a $600,000 decrease from the prior year, FY14. These rates do incorporate the impact of 2013 legislation. However, as I just mentioned, there is litigation pending, so these there's uncertainty and risk associated with the lower rates until the court challenges are resolved. We have received advisory rates from PERS for the FY16 budget, which is shown on the far right there. You can see that rates are expected to go up significantly, as increasing the general fund budget by $1.5 million in that year. Our final rates won't be known until later in this calendar year, and they will be based on 2013 returns for the FY16 rates. So now we'll talk just a bit about the general fund forecast. So as you may recall, the forecast is a planning tool that projects the financial condition of the general fund over the next 6 years. We use the forecast to understand the impact the long-term impact of decisions that we make today out into the future. If we were to take no action in the general fund in FY15, there would be a budget gap of $2.5 million, as shown on the left-hand side. The original budget gap was $5.3 million. However, that has been reduced to $2.5 million due to PERS savings, increased property tax revenues, and an agreement with eWeb. After incorporating the FY15 proposed budget actions into the forecast, expenditures will be more aligned, matching ongoing revenues with ongoing expenditures over the forecast period, stabilizing the general fund. Under this forecast, there's still a couple of years where we expect expenditures to be slightly above revenues, and we would use the reserve for revenue shortfall to fill those temporary budget gaps as we move forward. And in this slide, we're looking at the reserve for revenue shortfall. The red line shows the history of the adopted budget reserve for revenue shortfall over the past 10 years, and our projection for the forecast period as compared to our 8% target reserve level that's represented by the green dotted line. Under the FY15 proposed budget approach, we anticipate using the reserve as we have in past years to bridge financial events such as PERS rate increases as we move forward. Under current forecast assumptions, we expect to be significantly short of reserve levels as shown by the blue dotted line on the right. And as in the past, when we've drawn down on a reserve, we've built it back up so that we have future financial flexibility. It will be very important for us as we move forward to identify future one-time dollars to add back to our reserve to stabilize our savings account and to maintain our high bond rating. And next, I'll hand things back over to the City Manager to discuss the FY15 proposed budget strategies.
This is the proposed general fund budget of just over $165 million. What you can see in that, the bulk of that is for public safety between police and fire, with police taking the vast majority or a large portion of that. And you can get a sense of where those dollars are allocated. On Public Works, obviously $5.4 million is not their entire budget. That's just a portion of their parks maintenance is budgeted out of general fund. Much of what they do is in the transportation fund, the stormwater fund, the wastewater fund, airport fund, and those kinds of things. And so you can kind of get a sense of the relative magnitude of the various services. And here's the proposed budget on the resource side, and we'd be happy to answer any specific questions you have as we move forward. But again, as Twyla mentioned, the property taxes are the vast majority of what we do. I do think Sue and her team have done a pretty remarkable job of forecasting that over the years. What you saw in that one graph, even with this FY10 blip for the Hynex, being within 0.2%, across that period of time is pretty remarkable if you think about all the variables, particularly during the recession. And so I feel really comfortable with their forecast as we move forward. And so when we look at these kinds of things, I do think that's the pool of dollars that we have available to us. This is also an interesting slide. What this says is, and this compares 14 to 15, if we were to do the same slide over the last 5 or 6 years, the bars are relatively the same, which means during this period of time, the police department budget has actually increased. And that's really due to adding 9 new officers into the fleet or into their department, as well as some other kinds of things. What that also, though, represents is Chief Kearns and his folks have done a also very good job at continually trying to figure out efficiencies within their department themselves with respect to overtime and the use of the fleet and those kind of things, to actually try to reduce their costs overall while continuing to increase services out into the community in new and different ways. And so that's what you see as a part of that. The fire and emergency services, we've talked about all the work that's been done in that department with the merger. Their budget over these period of time has been increased as well. And so we're continuing to invest in our public safety as we work through this. Central services in this graph here shows it pretty even. Over the 4 or 5 year period, it's actually decreased from where it was before, and so the budgets have tended to filter down as we've continued to find ways within our common services that support all the operations. We've continued to figure out how to be more efficient with that. Our people are also running pretty hard, so that's a part of that as well. Library, recreation, and cultural services. You see this little bit of a shift here as kind of an uptick in the proposed FY15 budget. Over time, what you would have found is that department has actually decreased a little bit over time as they've continued to adjust the recreation and cultural services, some of which on the cultural side, you might remember what we've done is actually their cultural services subfund has actually absorbed some more of their general fund costs. And so they've been, while we think about that as just strictly a financial transaction, the reality is what that means is the people in that the cultural services subfund have been pretty creative in figuring out how to generate new revenue and continue to reduce their expenses. And so they've worked hard at doing that. Planning and development, somewhat even. You can show a little bit down in that fund. And then public works, again, that's the parks. And we know over the last couple of years there have been some reductions in our parks maintenance to include some in our proposed FY15 budget. And I know for this body and for the council, thinking about a sustainable parks and recreation budget is high priority for us, and so we'll have more of those conversations. Just another way of looking at the budget from on the capital side, the transportation, of course, primarily represents the bond that we're undertaking. The airport has a variety of projects going on, a significant project that'll be underway here shortly. And then you can kind of get a sense of some of the others. If you want some more detail, we have people that can answer those questions for you. So we get all the way down to how do we fill the $2.5 million gap. There's nothing new on this slide except one item. Everything that the Budget Committee approved back in February, this is exactly what you said in February, except we're suggesting one-time funding for Tracktown as we move towards the 2016 Olympic trials. We want to play a part of that, not only in supporting Tracktown and the recreation and the community value of that, but it is an economic prosperity or an economic development piece for us as we're successful in bringing people into town. And so we're recommending that. Everything else is exactly what you said before, whether it's the downtown library or we've talked about reducing a couple of positions, on our, 3 positions, equity, human rights, neighborhood sustainability. It's the same positions we've talked about before. There's nothing new about any of that. Parks maintenance is the same. Sheldon Branch Library, what the budget committee said is we want to fund that one time, encouraging a library levy, so that's what represents there. The Human Services Commission, discretionary funding. My original proposal was to actually shift that to mid-year. The Budget Committee said, no, we want to build that back in for this one time, so this builds it back in one time. The LRAPA, was passed by the Budget Committee to find $30,000 for ongoing funding, so there's $30,000 of ongoing funding for LRAPA in this. So this is exactly what you've seen before. The only difference is the Tracktown piece of that. We've shown this slide a couple of times because I think it's just a reminder of what we've been doing over the last several years. We're trying to be good financial stewards. The community invests $500 million with us every year, and we're trying to provide the services that they ask us to provide. We want to live within our means. We want to maintain a responsible savings account. At the same time, we're continuing to invest in community goals. We know that economic prosperity, particularly about increasing the tax base, has to be a near-term and long-term strategy for us to, as we work towards a sustainable budget. We're continuing to do that in a variety of ways, and we will always continue to look for ways that we can be more efficient with the dollars that we're provided. and we'll do that regardless of whether we have gaps or not into the future. And so that's just part of what we take as our responsibility. So we're focusing on stability, and then we want to move into sustainability. So just a quick summary. This proposed budget reflects all of the work that the Budget Committee and the community have done over the last 9 or 10 months. We continue to use principles that we started with back in FY09 of balancing customers, employees, and fiscal responsibility. We talked about this fundamental change in how we're budgeting and how our budget has actually structurally been different. We're stabilizing the general fund. It's an opportunity for the community to say, yes, we want to secure funding for some ongoing services, particularly around the library. We mentioned we do continue to use our reserves, and we want to continue to invest in the community. So with that, Laura, I'll
Thank
turn
you
it
very
back.
much. Thank you, John and staff. I know there's a lot of work that goes into preparing this. So we're now going to move into an opportunity for any questions that you had about what you just heard and or comments. Again, as I said earlier, our formal deliberations and motions will take place Thursday after public comment. But if you are considering a motion, it would be great to hear about it tonight so that we can prepare, thank you, for as productive a conversation as possible on Thursday. And so with that, I will open up the queue to any questions or comments. Okay, Councillor Poling.
Yeah, first of all, the $200,000 that has been added in, the one-time funding for the one-time Tracktown funding. Years ago, when Ben and Greg first came to the council talking about the Olympic trials in '08, I made a comment that in order to make money, you have to spend money. And I think the $200,000 of the one-time money going to Tracktown is, I hope it's adequate enough, because the amount of money, the millions and millions of dollars that those activities bring back into our community, into the restaurants, the hotels, the stores, and everything else, it's well worth the investment, and I'm very supportive of that. The other comment I'd like to make is that last night at our public forum, we heard from several people from the Eugene Public Library Foundation asking the council to perhaps get together and put a ballot measure out for library services funding in the November ballot. Now, I realize we've been discussing that in our revenue team discussions, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in that, but I also don't want to miss the opportunity to have that discussion at the Budget Committee level as well as the council level ahead of whatever else the revenue team brings forward. So perhaps if that is what the Budget Committee and council wants, to go ahead and put some kind of a serial levy out for the library services. So I haven't quite figured out the wording on it, but I'm probably going to put out a motion that the Budget Committee requests that the council put something out in November to fund the library services. Now, how much of that, I don't know, if it's the entire thing or just for the, bring the branch libraries back up to what the level of hours they had before the original cuts, as well as the half day. But that's a discussion that maybe we could have at that time.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. Well done. I think you've captured everything in our previous conversations and everything that the community put forward through all the work that's been done, and gave us a well-crafted thing to put in front of the community on Thursday. I just had a couple of questions for, I guess, future opportunities here. As I read this, the $10-11 million that we spend on PERS is what, 7-8% of the general? I mean, if I'm 159 million, so my math comes out right here. It's something like that, 6-7%, right? And on slide 23, where it shows the departmental breakouts on a year-to-year comparison here,
I'm going to go to that slide.
that'd be cool. But slide 23. I'm assuming that all the PERS costs are amortized amongst the departments, that they're not residing, for example, solely in central services. So when we're seeing the 77% personnel cost, it's reflected throughout each of those, depending on whatever the costs are. So we actually put a great deal of money into central services in terms of the personnel there, too. That's kind of what I was getting at. That's not hidden PERS costs in there.
No. True, it's not hidden PERS costs.
One of the other issues that I wonder about is that we talk about the representation of personnel costs as 74%, 75%, 6, and then this last year 7. So we've had a minor uptick, point or two a year in personnel costs over the last 8 or 9 years, probably at least. We've seen the portions of the general fund stuff increase over that time as well, but what I didn't see were actual dollars. And I'd really be interested to know, not necessarily just collections, because I think actual dollars were there for property tax collections, but actual dollars for what our expenditures are in the main sub-fund per year for the last 6 or 7. Because the way I read that, we've gone from spending, I don't know because it's not there, so I'm going to guess, 120 million, 130 million, 135. This year's 160 whatever million. So we're constantly increasing the amount of money we're actually spending, and at the same time we're increasing the percentage of that money that's spent on personnel over time. But that's not something this committee deals with, right? Personnel costs?
Right, in the sense that, yes.
That's an issue we should probably talk about at some point as a policy issue, I would think.
Yeah, that's why this slide, at least for me, has a lot of meaning, because what it says is yes, our expenditures do increase through the recession, so it's not as if the total budget's going down.
Right.
But it's been going up at significantly less rate, and particularly through the recession
Mid-years,
period.
yeah.
And that includes the shift of more of our costs to personnel costs at 77% versus 74 from 5 or 6 years ago. And so all that's included, and we're still at a place where we move forward in which our revenues are projected to exceed our expenses. So all that accounts for that, to include future PERS increases projected.
Thank you. But good job.
Thank you.
Bob.
Thank you. John, if you could bring up your slide 15, please. One of the things I think you can probably all agree over the last couple years, kind of been one of my things to make sure that we keep city people employed. That's been pretty important to me, while we can still provide the services that we provide. So I've been going through the departmental summaries that we've received in our packet. So I'm going to make a statement, and then I'll probably ask a question for clarification. In looking through, I want to commend the fire and emergency services. If you look across the line from 12 to 15, they've stayed at their FTEs, and in this upcoming year, they've managed to reduce their materials and services by almost $1 million. That's pretty remarkable. What I'm hoping is we can see those kind of trends in other departments, and here comes my question. I'm looking at the library recreation services, and we have talked about the reduction of the 4.4 employees, the FTEs. But in comparing the 14 budget to the 15 budget for employees, it stays the same. We're not really seeing any savings for that 4.4 reduction. Yet our materials and services for the library has gone up over $560,000, and in next year's budget we've added in $430,000 for capital outlay. So I'm seeing us spending more in the library, but now we're doing it with less people. Can you address that for me?
Yeah, somebody can help.
Here it comes, right? A minute. You can't see the clock. Can you see the clock?
I thought someone might ask that question. It's actually the reason why you see an uptick in this coming fiscal year is that we're planning for the replacement of our book sorter, which is a critical piece of operating the services, not just here, but the branches as well. It's a significant amount. We've been saving through our trust fund, so that's why you see it in maybe a slightly different fund.
That's the capital outlay.
It's in two places. It appears in capital outlay and materials and services. One of it is equipment replacement fund, and the other is the match from the department for that.
Thank you.
Great. Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, John, good, clear presentation, and thank you for being responsive to the Budget Committee. I think it's important to reiterate that we made $30 million in reductions in the general fund over 6 years and over 100 FTE. We now have the lowest FTE per capita in 30 years, meaning we have the smallest government we've probably ever seen, relatively speaking, to our population. And I think that's something to take note of. You know, the first 3 quarters of that $30 million we did without any service impacts to the public, which is good and bad. The good part was we were able to accomplish it without impacting services, but the bad part was we didn't tell anybody about it, so everybody said, what cuts? And so they were kind of behind-the-scenes cuts, but they were still significant, and it really puts us in a position of now having to reduce services because we've taken all of those measures of efficiency and things like that to eliminate them. Now we're cutting services, as you can see in this budget. I have a couple of questions. One refers to page 6 of the budget message and slide 20. You put slide 20 up, and that's the reserve for revenue shortfall. And that's the declining, almost to zero balance. And that's the city saving account or rainy day fund, which is a key measure of our fiscal health. And so in the text, it just says we're going to look for one-time sources to try to bolster this. It goes from our goal of 8% down to 4.7% in this budget, but by 2020, it's 1.3%. What's the plan for rectifying this?
Let me show this one other slide that relates. What's that slide where it's the jaws of uncertainty? Which slide
Killing
is that on the revenue side? Projected property tax.
Good idea.
That one, Mike. So it relates a little bit to this. How do you choose to budget that? And then it gets about how do we actually go back and fill it. One of the things that Twyla mentioned is if we're too pessimistic, and in this case what that would say is that we, rather than allowing the reserve for revenue shortfall to drift down towards that 1.3%, that what we say is, no, we don't want it to go below 2% or 2.5% or 3%. What that means is you end up having to recover. It's a larger gap. So you have to recover more in the early years in order to account for it in the out years. And what we're saying is, you can even see it in this growth curve here. There's less room under the curve on the optimistic side than on the pessimistic side. That says we're actually a little more optimistic than pessimistic as we go forward, right? And so we're hoping that plays itself out to include some of the implementation of Envision Eugene, some of the fulfillment of our economic prosperity plan, and all of those that it helps ensure that optimistic growth. So then specifically, how do we backfill it on an ongoing basis? I think we can do it a variety of ways. And so, for example, if we do have dollars at the end of the year, marginal beginning working capital, one place that we should invest some of those is back into our savings account, which is a legitimate use for that. It also says that every year as we go forward, we'll continue to relook those projections and adjust that as we go. And if there's ways that we could actually spend a little less of our reserves in the out years because it's actually better growth than we anticipated, or something else occurs, then some of that can fall back into the reserves as well. And I don't know, through the many years, occasionally there's one-time dollars that come up. It could be a sale of a piece of a property. There was a settlement years ago that helped fund the facilities fund, for example, those dollars could be put back into this reserve for revenue shortfall. I think one of the things that, I don't know if this is part of your point, but I'm going to sort of build on it, is as we move forward, and what we hope is that we're moving forward in a stable budget, what will happen is the tendency will be to try to creep back up. And so if things start looking a little bit better, our tendency will be to take that prosperity and then expend it, which is great. Except the problem is that we still end up with 1.3% of the reserves out in the out years. So we'll just want to be careful as we move forward, those kinds of things. So does that help at all, or is it?
Yeah, I think this is a real indicator of our fiscal health, and if you look at that graph on slide 20, our fiscal health in the future isn't doing very well. And I appreciate what you said, and hoping that we get to that green dashed line on the previous graph, and we get some one-time monies. That's kind of a hope plan as opposed to a real plan. And I think this is the most significant part of this whole budget this year, is that this decline in this reserves. And I think it's a bad fiscal policy in the long run, and it puts us in a precarious position. One of the things that opponents of the service fee said was, why don't you just increase the property tax collection rate? On page 6, you still have it at 94.3. They suggested maybe going as high as 97. That would help solve the problem, wouldn't it?
Only if they actually came in.
Well, go back to whatever slide.
Which is a slide?
13.
So what happens here, Twyla explained, there are two different ways you could state the property tax collection rate. One way would be the rate that people pay versus the tax bills that are sent out. The other is the rate that people pay versus the tax bills that were sent out minus the 3% discount, minus any adjustments or roll corrections or anything else that goes on. Both of those are shown here. The amount of revenue you get at the end is exactly the same. So there's a 3 percentage point, roughly 3 percentage point difference between those two methods of calculating your collection rate, but the revenues that come in are exactly the same. And you can see on the right-hand side that the way that we've been projecting our property taxes has been very accurate over the past 10 years.
Right, I know that's in FY12 it was 94.6, FY13 it was 94.3, and we're suggesting again 94.3%. I can't see how much time I have.
You're in the yellow. 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Okay, I'll need another round.
You want to go in round 2? Okay. Marty.
I guess on a related note, the history is that our personnel costs rise at a greater rate than our property tax revenues. And so while a library levy is one of the contenders coming out of the Revenue Committee, there are others as well. And one thing I would like to explore is when you're looking at those, or based on what we recommend, we might want to look at what we're projecting in terms of increases in personnel costs and whether the revenue method that is selected, assuming one is selected, is going to track personnel costs closer than property tax. Because the problem you start running into is, so you bump up property tax collections, well, those are rising at a certain rate and your personnel costs are still rising at a faster rate. So you do postpone an eventual reckoning by collecting more in property taxes, but fundamentally you're still choosing a revenue source which rises at a lower rate than your personnel costs. So one of the missing pieces as we go forward in the Revenue Committee, I think, should be sort of a financial analysis of what grows at approximately the same rate versus what grows at a lower rate, so we can make a recommendation based on that.
Thank you. So I have 2 people in round 2. Is there anyone else who would like to be heard before we go into the second round? Okay, great. So I have Councilor Clark first.
Thank you. Slide number 13, please. As I look at the graph on the right, what I understand that graph to say is those are the amounts collected in each of those years, right? That's not a fund number that That's not a certain amount, and then we collect a little more, and the fund is this amount, and then we collect a little more, and the fund is this amount. That's the amount each year that's collected in total, right? Slide number 20, please. This is the reason I'm asking this question is because we always have this conversation, and I hear some of my colleagues discuss this in different ways sometimes. So I want to make sure we do it, and I get it clear. So as I look at the different years, when we talk about reserve for revenue shortfall, we are not talking about a fund balance as we look at that, but instead the amount we are authorizing each year to remain unspent. Do I have that right? Is that correct? That's a correct way to discuss that. So we're not, essentially it's a bad metaphor to say we're building up or losing our savings account. Because we're not talking about what the cumulative number is. If we save and don't spend, for example, $2 million this year, and we don't spend it, and then we save and don't spend $2 million next year, we've saved $4 million. But the graph that we were looking at of it would look flat, like that green line does. So when we talk about this,
No, it'd be 4 million. It
This
would
is
go
the
up.
cumulative balance.
this is the point I want to get to, because this is something that we always have an argument about, and I want to make sure I understand it right after all these years. So instead of saying how much that we're saving in each or allocating towards a reserve in each of those years, what that measures is what the fund balance is. Is that correct?
But the way I look at it, and you guys can chime in, I almost look like at this, and it's probably not accounting perfect, is it's actually your savings account that you have money in. So you have your operating budget over here, and you have this savings account.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of FY14, we expect to have actually $5 million of cash sitting in a savings account somewhere. So at the end of 14. So when we think about how we're going to budget for next year, we say how much money is coming in on revenues, how much expenditures, and then we're going to use this amount, and that means that's what's actually physically remaining. Now you have to appropriate those dollars.
Right.
But
So to make sure we're talking about it accurately, what you'd like the green line to be essentially is to say, we would like to save from this point forward a few $100,000 a year to add to that savings account based on that green line, right?
right.
So we would only be not spending a couple $100,000 a year. It's not that we would unallocate $8 million in that course of that year. That would be the fund balance as it goes forward, right?
It feels like you're mixing apples and oranges in there.
Well,
So
this
what are
is
you
the
trying- what are
problem
you
is that
trying
we
to-
don't ever have a clear conversation about reserve for revenue shortfall, and it kind of inhibits our discussions at times. That's why I'd like to make sure we're clear about it.
But except the way I think about it is it's a fixed amount that's sitting there. And if you have $2 million sitting in this account, that same $2 million you can either keep in the account next year, you can spend it, or you can add more to that account. It's not
Right.
as if it's not this, you can't spend that $2 million and then spend it again next year because it's not there.
Right, and again, what I'm saying is this particular graph here measures over the course of those years what we'd like that balance of that savings account to be.
Well,
Not
I
the
look
amount we'd add to it, correct?
right.
Thank you. Okay, that's what I wanted to be clear.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Councilor Zelinski.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow on that, I think of this as our savings account, our rainy day fund. It protects us from having to cut services, and it's how much we have in the bank. And right at the end of this fiscal year, we'll have $4.7 million in it. We want to have about 6 or 7. And over time, it goes to less than $2 million that we have in our savings account. And I think that's a bad strategy, but that's what's embedded in this budget. So we need to focus on that and over the next couple of years. Different question. On page 13, which has budget strategy, recreational service fee increases of $150,000 and $50,000 in scholarships. One question is, how many people is that low-income participant, how many people does that represent for $50,000 decrease is question one. Question two is, we might have an unintended consequence here, that we did save the pool, but we made them unusable by the people that that were the very people that clamored to keep them open, which is Emerald Aquatics. My understanding is that the city's asking for, in part, I suspect, because of this, a 25% increase in their fees for the youth program and over 50% for their adult program. And as of next Friday, Emerald Aquatics said they can't afford that, and they're going to shut down the adult program. And probably the youth program won't survive another year. So what we've done is we've saved pools, but we're not making them usable because we've increased someplace else to have our need to have cost increases. So I think that's not what I intended to see happen by putting together this package. I hope it's not what other people had intended. Is there a way to avoid that outcome from happening? Can you bring back some creative ideas to avoid having Emerald Aquatics end its adult program and probably in a year or so end its, because we've seen 2% increases in the amount of money we're asking for from Emerald Aquatics, which is, inflation basically, but 25 and 50% is pretty dramatic and it's not sustainable and they're closing down.
What I'd like to do is bring back the full story that we can share with this body, not only about that particular club, but the rest of the clubs who have come to an agreement on the fee schedule. So we'd be happy to bring all of that back.
Okay, good. That'd be great. Thanks. I just wanted to point out that.
And you're just about out of time.
Oh, no, the end of the round.
Thank you. Could you go to slide 16? This is the section about the PERS assets and liabilities, which obviously have an impact on the city. A lot of what you hear when you talk to folks in the community about the systemic problems in government is PERS. PERS comes up all the time. When you look at this in terms of what it is costing us to service PERS, the liabilities, how much of that is within the control of the city of Eugene? So this chart we're looking at is something that's happening to us, not something that we can control. So if we even wanted to have an impact on this and change this, we couldn't because it's the state. Essentially.
We have had an impact, but we had to sue the PERS board.
Okay, outside of a lawsuit in court, it's not something we have control over. So in other words, if the budget committee said, wow, this PERS rate's too high, our personnel costs are getting out of control, change this, we couldn't. We have to accept this the way it is. Can you go back one slide? So if I look at the personnel costs at the bottom, I realize that the shift from 74 to 77 that's occurred over these last 8 years, or 7 years, 8 years, it's not all attributable to PERS, but if you had to guess what part of that is the shift in PERS that has kind of affected that rate, would that be a noticeable part of that change? Has PERS affected that rate somewhat?
Yes, certainly.
So some of that increase, not all, but some of that increase is beyond our control. Some of it is within our control, but some of it is not. And it's been a 2% increase over the last 8 years, which in some regards is not a huge amount. But part of it is not within our control. But if the budget committee were to say, even 2% I don't like, you need to change that, taking the PERS out of it, what would be left? Looking up at the left, what makes up that 77% is salaries, retirement, health charges, and taxes. So the budget committee would be saying, cut salaries and benefits, would be if you wanted to reduce that, right? I'm asking sort of rhetorical questions, but that's
Or cut the number of people.
Yeah. And for a lot of the city's budget, salaries, benefits, health charges are through collective bargaining.
Right.
So the budget committee can't say cut salaries and benefits without opening up collective bargaining discussions, which
Right, we won't.
which is the whole separate conversation. So if we wanted to have it, we have to go into a conversation knowing that we're dealing with collective bargaining and union contracts for a large percent of our staff.
Right, and then there's other conversations that will need to be had.
So it's not saying that you can't have a conversation about salaries and benefits, but you have to go into it knowing what that implies. things you have no control over, PERS, and other things which are negotiated outside of this room in other entire settings. So it's I guess what I'm getting at is this is a very complicated combination of moving parts that are not easy to talk about. And then the last piece in my yellow period would be to say, are we out of whack with other communities in terms of our salaries and benefits? And the impression I've had is we're not necessarily out of whack in terms of what we pay.
I would say that's true. We can get more info on that, but I would say that's true. And I wouldn't want to leave the impression that our employees have been held harmless through this period either, because that's not the case by any stretch of the imagination. And so employees have been impacted both in salaries and in benefits, both for collective bargaining units and those that are not within collective bargaining units. And so they, all 1,500 employees in one way or another have stepped up and said, yes, we understand the fiscal realities in the community and we aren't holding ourselves harmless. So I don't want to leave that impression either.
Right, good, thank you.
Thank you. Chelsea?
I want to say thanks to Councilor Pulling for summarizing a little bit about what Tracktown does, but I want to make sure I understand what we're funding there. Is Tracktown a nonprofit? Can you say a little bit about what it is, and can you give some tangible examples of what they do?
I'll ask Renee to come up and talk about that.
Pizza. They make pizza.
We're ordering a lot of pizza.
So Tracktown, if you recall, Oregon Track Club was the nonprofit sponsor of previous Olympic trials. Since they've been so successful in bringing all these really international events as well as national level events, Oregon Track Club spun off into another nonprofit to run these events. So it's really a separate organization, but yet charged with operating the events that we've come to expect in the community. So they operate all of the NC2A events, USA Track and Field events, World Juniors, which are coming here in July, the USA Juniors. Pretty much any major track and field event is organized by their staff.
So they work in conjunction with the university, presumably, because that's where I see all the track events happen.
Well, Hayward Field is the venue, so that's why you would see that at university. But the University of Oregon is a city partner, as is Lane County, City of Springfield, Travel Lane County, Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, thanks. That's all I have.
Okay, great. Will?
So I have a different take on this particular page here, and as we're going back and forth on it, one of the things that I understand has happened in the past 7-8 years is we've really driven expenses down through creative cuts in our materials and in our way we do business as a city. And I would be interested in seeing, so this graph this chart right here is telling you, as a whole, for fiscal year 08, personnel was 74 and materials and services was 26%.
Correct.
But it's not telling you year over year what materials and services did between fiscal year 08 and 09, for example. You can see the number is 26% here and 26% here, but that doesn't actually mean that it went up or down. It just so a different way of looking at this graph would actually be two different lines, one for materials and services, like referencing itself, or as a constant dollar amount changing, and same with personnel's constant dollar amount. Because I'm conjecturing here, I'm wondering here, without having the data in front of me to go back and look at the previous 8 years, is part of the increase percentage in personnel an actual decrease percentage in materials and services through creative cost savings?
Some of that is, but you have to, if you go back to this slide. True. But we've actually eliminated 100+ positions.
Right.
And so that could be through efficiencies, it could be reorganizations, it could be a variety of things, but probably in this, yeah.
So one thing that would make that more obvious would be a graph that would show, or the same data but presented in dollar amount on a year-over-year basis. And then you could easily see, oh, yeah, it's gone up, but it's the reason for it is because of the materials and services has increased at a much lower rate than this one,
Right.
To me, that because it's out of the whole pie every year, I can't get as big a picture.
Right, and the purpose of that graph is really just to not show the details, which we could. It's to show the relative magnitude of personnel costs versus M&S, and that we know personnel costs make up a huge part of our budget, and so it does matter what we do around personnel costs, which then says, at the end of the day, if you want to really stabilize the budget, what it does mean is you do have to reduce that organizational footprint, or you're never going to get there because we don't control everything, all the inputs. And so that's what that graph is trying to show, not specifically how many dollars are spent every year. It's to kind of relate it back to some of these other kinds of things. But we do have that data. We'd be happy to.
I guess my concern is that makes it look like our personnel costs are rising a whole bunch. And maybe they are, but I don't actually know that from that chart, because maybe that really our personnel are doing a great job of cutting the materials and services, and so therefore it looks like personnel costs are rising.
Right, I understand. And so it's, and we can, yes, we can provide that. From what I look at and where I sit are these kinds of things that says, so where are we headed in the aggregate, and is the budget stable? Now, within that 2.6%, I don't know specifically what percentage of that is personnel
77.
versus M&S in the sense of gross dollars every year as we kind of work through that. But we would have that.
Thank you. So I have Councilor Zelenka in round 3. Anyone else before we go there? No? Okay, Councilor Zelenka.
So I did want to talk about and compare what we're doing today to what we said we were going to do when we were working on the service fee campaign, because we did choose to kick the can down the road by using $5.6 million of our reserve, which in part created our problem with the reserves. Not in part, that's what created the problem with our reserves, which we'd have to figure out how to fix over time. But in part, what I see happening over the last year was we got lucky and we did pretty much what we said we were going to do. In part, we got lucky with the PERS reform that the legislature did in the interim between after the service fee lost and where we are today, is when they came back and saved us well over $1 million, which allowed us to, and the economy got a little better, and that allowed us to save police and fire cuts and the pools to most degree. But the other part of what we're doing, the $2.5 million, is pretty much what we said we were going to do back then. And it's the same list that has actually been floating around for about 5 years now. It's just a subset of it. So, and none of those ideas or vaporware ideas that were talked about were either possible or were adopted in this budget. And so those things that sounded real easy and were kind of sounded too good to be true, well, that's because they were. And so we ended up having $2.5 million cuts. Half a day at the library, $150,000 in rec fee increases, and cuts in travel, HR, Human Rights Commission is less outreach, less reporting, less leadership. Neighborhoods are getting cut, newsletters are getting cut, parks maintenance is going to go down. We're going to see brown grass and weeds, and we're using more one-time money to dig ourselves a little deeper to save Sheldon for a year. Hopefully the levy will pass. And we didn't have any cuts in police and fire and the pools, and actually we saw increases in all of those. So what I think happened is we got part lucky, and we did exactly what we were going to say. That we did exactly what we said we were going to do, except for one thing, which was to reduce our reserves, which was I think a bad fiscal policy. I voted against it the first time it was around, and I still think this is a bad idea, and we're going to need to focus our attention on that. And I hope, Mr. City Manager, over the next year we can come up with a more solid plan than we hope we're on the right dotted line on the graph to help us dig our way out of that hole, because our savings account is going to be depleted over time. if we stay on this course.
Great, thank you. Councilor Clark.
As my colleague has brought up on a couple of rounds, the conversations around the extra tax campaign, I can't help but notice that with all of the alarmist rhetoric that was put out during that campaign, I'm just want to congratulate everybody because it turns out the sky didn't fall. Good job.
Marty.
When I think of balancing the property tax revenue increases versus the personnel cost increases, we've talked about basically COLA increases, and we've talked about PERS. The other thing historically has been an issue is the increasing cost of health insurance over time, and that's far exceeded. Have we seen any change in that? I know that was one of the hopes that would come out of the Affordable Care Act, but I just was asking if that does that change, because that might change our calculus going forward as well.
All I would say is that we've been managing our health care costs pretty closely, and they've been going up roughly about a 5% incline, which is a lot slower than some of the other growth rates around that, 5 to 7%. And so we've, on a national trend, it's been somewhere between 10 and 12%. And so we've been managing that through a lot of work with the employees, and the employees picking up a greater cut of their health care costs and things like that. So it's going up, and you're right to recognize the fact that it is part of the personnel cost increase, but it's not growing at the rate other agencies are experiencing because we're doing a good job of managing it. And we have a self-insured health program.
I'll just give you an example. That if you look at the fire department, between the chief and the union, Mike Barnaby and his group, they've actually done quite a bit to reduce their health care exposure and cost by how they go about wellness, for one, as well as how the shifts work and some things that were bargained through previous contracts. So I would agree with Christy. Murney does a great job of trying to manage that pretty tightly, even though I think we're starting to see health care continue to tick up a little bit more than what we hope, and so we'll just pay attention to it.
5's a lot better than 12.
5's better than 12.
Jill.
First of all, thank you to the city manager and the staff, and I think the budget you brought back is what you were asked to do, and thank you for that. And I feel, as I hear Councilor Zelenka discussing, that I'm glad we're lucky. I'm glad the universe shifted enough and saved us $2.5 million, but it seems to me that we have not asked much of ourselves in the creativity department. If I notice this, which I also look very good, made me feel good about myself, except for the fact that, we reviewed, as a member of the budget or the revenue committee, we reviewed ideas, but we haven't discussed any of those, right? And it's like cut, and unintended consequences and everything else. But my understanding last year was that we were going to come up with some creative ideas so we're not kicking the can down the road, not that we were going to look at the same old list and just, I guess, throw our hands up in despair and go, well, I guess, we were hoping a prayer saved us $2.5 million, and I guess we'll just go back to the old list and hack away the rest, So I guess I just say to myself and to everybody, I would ask us to maybe ask a little of ourselves and think about what we can do to raise some money, some many good ideas out there that would have very, very low impact, like the one that just, to me, is the low-hanging fruit. As a business attorney, people go, oh, so how much is it going to cost to set up an LLC or a corporation? Oh, what's the city business tax? I go, oh, yay, nothing, Everyone just goes, really? I don't have to pay a license or anything to the city? Excellent. So to me, that's low-hanging fruit. And I'd ask us to be creative, myself included, and come up with something so we don't spend our time looking at that boring, uninspired list, and find a way to ask more of ourselves and our citizens to bring more money into our community so we can fund the things that are important to us. So, thank you.
Okay, if there are no other comments, questions, I'm sorry, Councilor Taylor.
I'll just make one. I agree with Jill that I thought we were going to look for new sources of revenue, and I think that's where we should have started instead of ending. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so at this point, if there's no other comments or questions, we'll adjourn for this evening. We'll be back here Thursday for public comment and deliberations. Thank you all.
Thank you.